building for months, and I genuinely could not wait any longer to cover it because the numbers finally caught up with the story. Bill Gates built an empire on one simple idea. Windows would be the default operating system on every desk on the planet, and for 30 years, that bet basically won every single time. Right now, in 2026, that empire is facing a challenge from a direction almost nobody expected. Not from Apple, not from Google, but from a free Linux distribution most people had never heard of 2 years ago. It's called Zorin OS. Here's the number that stopped me mid-scroll when I first found it. Zorin OS 18 crossed 2 million downloads in under 3 months of its release, according to figures the Zorin team confirmed directly and that were independently reported by outlets including Windows Central and Tech Republic. Roughly 3/4 of those downloads, over 1 million, came specifically from people previously running Windows 10 or Windows 11, not Linux hobbyists hopping between distros, Windows users leaving. And by April 2026, 6 months after launch, the Zorin team reported the number had climbed even further, past 3.3 million downloads total. I want you to sit with that for a second, because in the Linux world, numbers like that just don't happen. Desktop Linux has been fighting for mainstream relevance for over 30 years. The year of the Linux desktop became such a running joke in tech circles that people stopped saying it unironically. So when a single distribution pulls over 1 million confirmed Windows defectors in 3 months, that's not a normal blip. That's a real shift, and the story behind why it happened is what this video is actually about. Well, let's go back to the specific date that makes this whole thing click into place. October 14th, 2025. If you were paying attention to tech news that week, you already know what happened. Microsoft officially ended free support for Windows 10. No more security patches, no more updates unless you specifically paid for extended security updates. Hundreds of millions of people woke up running an operating system Microsoft had, in practical terms, closed the door on. That alone was going to frustrate a lot of people. But here's the detail that made me stop and actually start researching this properly. On that exact same day, October 14th, 2025, Zorin OS 18 launched. Microsoft closed one door. Zorin was standing in the hallway holding another one open. I've looked at a lot of product timing in tech, and I genuinely can't think of a cleaner coincidence. Except it wasn't quite a coincidence, because Zorin's team has been building specifically toward Windows. 10 refugees for years, watching that end of support date approach the same way everyone else in the industry was. But before we get into what Zorin actually does differently, we need to understand what Microsoft's own decisions did to set this moment up, because that backstory is what makes the rest of this make sense. According to analysis from the research firm Canalys, roughly 240 million PCs, close to 1 in every 5 Windows machines in use, don't meet the hardware requirements for Windows 11. Not broken, not slow. Simply ruled incompatible by requirements Microsoft itself wrote, the biggest of which is a security chip called TPM 2.0 that a huge number of otherwise perfectly capable machines simply don't have. Canalys didn't mince words about what that means for where those machines end up. In their own report, they put it like this: if every one of those incompatible laptops were stacked flat, one on top of another, the pile would reach roughly 600 kilometers taller than the moon. That's not a stat I'm exaggerating for effect. That's the research firm's own framing, because the environmental math on that many, obsolete by policy machines, is genuinely staggering. And the hardware wall was only the first piece. Over the past couple of years, Windows itself changed in ways that a lot of longtime users found increasingly hard to ignore. Advertisements began showing up inside the Start menu and File Explorer on an operating system people had already paid for. Telemetry settings got scattered across multiple menus, in a way plenty of users found deliberately hard to fully opt out of. Copilot, Microsoft's AI assistant, got pushed directly into the taskbar as a persistent, hard-to-remove presence for a huge share of users, whether they'd asked for it or not. And when Windows 10's support clock finally ran out, Microsoft's answer for holdouts wasn't, here's a free extension. It was a paid extended security updates program, which plenty of users online have since described as feeling less like a safety net and more like a countdown they were being charged to slow down. That's the corner a lot of ordinary, non-technical users found themselves backed into by mid to late 2025. Pay to stay secure, buy new hardware you don't actually need, or find something else. And when people started actually searching for something else, a lot of them found the answer wasn't complicated or intimidating at all. It was sitting right there, polished and completely free. In the next section, I'm going to walk you through exactly what Zorin OS did differently, and why it's succeeding in a way that decades of Linux alternatives before it never quite managed to pull off. So here's the question I kept circling back to while researching this. Linux has existed for over 3 decades. There have been dozens of desktop-focused distributions. Ubuntu, Linux Mint, Fedora, Manjaro, all free, all technically capable, all trying in their own way to pull users away from Windows. And for 30 years, none of them cracked the mainstream in any lasting way. Desktop Linux's global share sat stubbornly in the low single digits for so long that it became a punchline. So what did Zorin OS actually do differently? Why now, and why this one specifically? I went through a good number of forum threads, Reddit, discussions, and tech publication reviews trying to answer that. And what kept coming up, it wasn't really technical at all. It was psychological. And the reason most people never seriously tried Linux was never really, it can't do what I need. It was the fear of sitting down in front of an unfamiliar screen and feeling completely lost, not knowing where the settings are, not knowing how the taskbar works, having to unlearn decades of muscle memory just to open a file. That single friction point kept Linux firmly in enthusiast territory while Windows dominated without needing to try particularly hard. Zorin looked directly at that fear and built its entire interface around eliminating it. Boot into Zorin OS 18 for the first time as a longtime Windows user, and here's roughly what greets you. A taskbar along the bottom, a start-style app menu in the corner, a system tray, window snapping, a built-in app search, dark mode, smooth animations. It's not a Windows clone exactly. It's closer to a distillation of exactly where your muscle memory expects things to be, wrapped in an interface that still feels modern and intentional rather than like a knockoff. Reviewers and switchers consistently describe roughly the same reaction. They expected to feel lost, and that feeling dissolved within about 30 seconds because everything was close enough to where habit told them it would be. The installation experience matters just as much because historically, setup has been the second biggest wall keeping casual users away from Linux. Entirely. For years, installing a Linux distro could mean wrestling with manual partitioning, hunting down drivers, and burning an entire weekend. Zorin OS 18 strips almost all of that friction out. Full installation runs in minutes, using plain language throughout the process, rather than technical jargon. NVIDIA driver support is a simple checkbox during setup. Telemetry choices are shown clearly on screen rather than buried 3 menus deep. And critically, the installer automatically detects an existing Windows installation and offers to configure dual boot right there during setup, meaning you keep Windows fully intact, boot into Zorin alongside it, and can genuinely test drive the switch with zero risk to your existing files or software. That single design decision removes what was arguably the single biggest psychological barrier, keeping curious users from ever trying Linux at all. The fear that trying it meant committing to it. Zorin OS 18.1, which shipped in April 2026, pushed this further, specifically for people migrating apps and files, not just the operating system itself. According to Zorin's own release notes and coverage from Windows Central and TechSpot, 18.1 expanded its built-in Windows app detection database to recognize installers for over 240 common Windows applications, automatically pointing users toward native Linux alternatives instead of leaving them to sideload Windows executables through a compatibility layer. It also added OneDrive integration through the Files app for users, who still rely on Microsoft's cloud storage, fingerprint reader support for older laptops, and, notably, switched the default browser to Brave, a decision the team attributed partly to growing user concerns about the direction of Firefox's privacy stance. Support for 18.1 runs through June 2029, which the team is positioning specifically towards schools, small businesses, and organizations that need a long runway before their next migration decision. Here's what actually keeps people from going back to Windows once they've made the jump. And I think this is the part that gets undercovered in most tech reporting on this story. Once you're inside Zorin OS, what stands out isn't what's there, it's what's missing. No advertisements in the start menu, File. Explorer equivalent, or settings. No forced account sign-in just to use your own machine. No AI assistant running persistently in the background. No telemetry toggles scattered across half a dozen menus. Updates install on your schedule, not on a timer set by someone else. Individually, some of these might sound like minor conveniences. Stacked together, they represent something bigger. The difference between owning a computer outright and feeling like you're renting the experience from a company whose business incentives don't always line up with your own preferences. Then there's the practical performance angle, which matters enormously for the specific population Windows 11 locked out. Zorin, like most lightweight Linux distributions, tends to run with noticeably lower idle resource usage than Windows 11 on the same hardware, particularly on older machines that Windows 11 simply refuses to install on. For a laptop, Canalys already flagged as headed toward that 240 million PC e-waste pile. Spending an afternoon installing Zorin from a USB drive can mean the difference between a machine going in a landfill and one running a modern, fully patched operating system for several more years. That's not a marginal feature for the people this applies to. It's the entire reason they're searching for an alternative in the first place. That's the story so far. A hardware wall built by Microsoft's own requirements, a growing list of user-facing frustrations with modern Windows, and a Linux distribution that showed up at exactly the right moment with the friction almost entirely engineered out of it. But there's a bigger dimension to this story than product design, and it circles back to Bill Gates himself. Not because he's commented on Zorin OS specifically, because he hasn't, but because of something he said publicly, on the record, about a nearly identical pattern happening once before. That's where we're headed next. Let's get into the part of this story that I think genuinely deserves the most attention, because it's the piece almost nobody connects back to Gates directly, even though he's the one who put it on the record himself. In 2019, speaking at a Village Global event, Gates called losing the mobile operating system war to Android his greatest mistake ever at Microsoft. His actual quote, which has been reported consistently across CNBC, Forbes, and Windows Central, among others, was this. He said the mismanagement that kept Microsoft from becoming what Android is today cost the company an estimated $400 billion in market value that effectively transferred from Google to Microsoft instead. He said the non-Apple mobile platform was a natural thing for Microsoft to win, and they didn't, largely because the company was distracted fighting antitrust battles and didn't put its best people on the problem while the opportunity window was open. I want to be completely transparent with you here. Gates has not made any public statement about Zorin OS specifically, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But the pattern he described in 2019 is worth putting directly next to what's happening on the desktop right now, because it's strikingly similar. A dominant incumbent controls a platform for years, a free, open, non-proprietary alternative. Linux, in both cases, since Android is itself built on the Linux kernel, sits there as the obvious contender in the everything that isn't the dominant player lane. And the incumbent doesn't lose because the challenger suddenly gets dramatically better overnight. It loses because its own decisions create the opening. That's essentially the exact mechanism Gates described costing Microsoft the mobile market, and it's arguably playing out again on the desktop, just a decade and a half later and through a different door. The desktop numbers back this up more than most people realize. Linux's global desktop share, which sat between roughly 2 and 3% for the better part of 2 decades according to StatCounter tracking, has been climbing steadily through 2025 and into 2026. Independent year-end estimates for 2025 put it as high as 4.7%, its highest level on record, with the United States individually crossing the 5% threshold for the first time in mid-2025. On Steam specifically, Linux hit an all-time high of 5.33% of active users in March 2026. None of those numbers alone rewrite the desktop landscape overnight. Windows still holds the overwhelming majority of the market, with some trackers showing it above 90% of installs even amid this growth. But the trajectory matters more than the current snapshot, and within that broader Linux growth curve, Zorin OS is consistently the name showing up across migration communities, Reddit threads, and comment sections, from former Windows users documenting their switch in real time. Here's why that specific demographic detail, over 1 million confirmed Windows defectors in 3 months, matters more than the raw download count by itself. When developers see meaningful numbers of users moving to a platform, they eventually start building and testing for it. When hardware manufacturers see real demand, they start certifying compatibility. When software companies see where their customers actually are, their product roadmaps shift. That's the exact network effect that kept Windows dominant for 30 years without much effort. Inertia protected by the fact that everyone else was already there. The uncomfortable question for Microsoft is whether that same logic is now capable of running in reverse, even slowly, the same way it did in mobile. I want to be honest about the limits of this story too, because overselling it would be dishonest. Gaming remains the most significant practical gap. Zorin runs Windows games through Valve's Proton compatibility layer, and while a large share of titles now perform close to native Windows levels, that's not universal. Some anti-cheat systems and specific titles still don't run reliably. If competitive, maximum frame rate gaming across every title is your top priority, that's a real limitation worth knowing about upfront, not something to discover a few weeks in and feel misled about. For the vast majority of everyday computing, browsing, documents, spreadsheets, video calls, streaming, general creative work, Zorin genuinely covers the use case for most people who'd be reading this far into a video like this one. And there's a generational piece to this that I think is underreported. Users entering the workforce now didn't grow up with 30 years of Windows muscle memory anchoring them to one platform by default. A lot of them came up on Chromebooks in school and are already comfortable moving between operating systems without much friction. At the same time, the shift toward browser-based tools, Google Docs, Notion, Figma, and similar, has quietly weakened one of Windows' most durable structural advantages. The argument that I need Windows because that's where my software runs is a genuinely weaker argument in 2026 than it was even 5 years ago, because so much of what people actually use daily now runs identically in a browser, regardless of the operating system underneath it. Zorin, sitting on top of Firefox or its now default Brave browser, handles that reality without friction. So where does this actually leave Microsoft? And is there any realistic scenario where Windows 12 slows this down rather than accelerates it? That's the question I want to close on, because it's the one that actually determines whether 2026 ends up being remembered as a blip or a genuine inflection point, and it connects directly back to that Gates quote about winner-take-all platform markets. And what happens when the incumbent doesn't see the shift coming until the numbers are already undeniable? Let's close this out with where things actually stand, because I want to give you the accurate picture rather than the more dramatic one. A lot of coverage earlier this year ran with rumors of an AI-first, subscription-based Windows 12, supposedly, launching sometime in 2026, complete with a rumored code name and hardware requirements. I want to be straight with you. Those specific rumors were debunked. Microsoft has publicly confirmed as recently as this year that there's no announced Windows 12 shipping in 2026. The company's stated focus has been stabilizing and refining Windows 11 itself, while continuing to fold Copilot and other AI features into that existing platform incrementally, rather than launching a completely new numbered release. So, if you've seen headlines promising a radical AI subscription overhaul landing any day now, treat that with real skepticism. It's not what Microsoft has actually confirmed. But here's what matters more than any specific rumor. The direction of travel doesn't need a new version number to matter. Microsoft's public roadmap for Windows 11 itself has been consistently AI forward. Deeper Copilot integration, a growing Copilot plus Seus PC hardware tier built around dedicated AI processing requirements, and continued expansion of features that run in the background whether or not individual users specifically asked for them. Whatever the next major Windows release ends up being called, or whenever it actually ships, the company's own public statements and product decisions over the past year give little indication that the underlying strategy is reversing course. And that's precisely the dynamic that makes Bill Gates' own words from 2019 worth revisiting one more time before we wrap up. Gates was talking about mobile when he called it Microsoft's greatest mistake ever. The failure to win what he described as a natural winner-take-all. Platform opportunity lost not because Android was overwhelmingly superior on day one, but because Microsoft's internal focus was elsewhere while the market's patience ran out. He explicitly framed these platform shifts as winner-take-all moments, the kind where a company either seizes the opening or watches billions in market value move to whoever does. Whether the same dynamic is now unfolding on the desktop, more slowly and less dramatically, is genuinely an open question. And it's one that current numbers make hard to dismiss outright, even if it's far too early to call it decided. Windows still commands the overwhelming majority of desktop installs worldwide, by a wide margin. This isn't a story about an empire collapsing overnight. It's a story about a crack that's real, growing, and happening, for reasons Microsoft's own policy decisions directly created. What actually makes this moment different from every previous Linux is finally taking off. Prediction over the past 30 years is the audience doing the switching. It's not developers. They've had Linux as an option for decades, and plenty already used it. It's not IT professionals. They've always known the alternatives existed. The people showing up in Zorin's download numbers are largely ordinary users. People with older laptops that Windows 11 simply refuses to install on. People frustrated by ads inside a paid operating system. People who don't want an AI assistant running persistently in the background. People who just want their computer to do what they tell it without negotiating. Those are exactly the users platform incumbents have always assumed were too locked in, too unfamiliar with alternatives, or too comfortable with a familiar interface to ever seriously leave. That assumption is precisely what's being tested right now in real time by over 1 million confirmed switches in a matter of months. There's also a slower moving structural shift working in the same direction, one that has nothing to do with any single company's decisions. The rise of browser-based tools, Google Docs, Figma, Notion, and similar platforms that run identically regardless of the operating system underneath, has quietly weakened one of Windows' most durable competitive advantages, the old argument that people needed Windows specifically because that's where their software lived. That argument is measurably weaker today than it was even 5 years ago, and it applies just as much to Zorin OS as it does to any other modern Linux distribution. Running a capable browser, none of this required Linux to become dramatically better overnight. It required the incumbent to make staying increasingly less appealing, and for a genuinely accessible alternative to be standing at the door when that tipping point arrived. So here's the honest bottom line, and I think it's worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Microsoft didn't lose these particular users to a rival's marketing campaign or a technological breakthrough. It lost them to its own accumulated decisions, a hardware requirement that ruled out 240 million functioning machines, ads inside paid software, an AI assistant nobody explicitly asked to run persistently in the background, and a support cutoff that left a huge population of otherwise capable computers facing either a paid extension or the landfill. Zorin OS didn't have to convince anyone Linux was suddenly perfect. It just had to remove the friction of trying it and be sitting there, ready, on the exact day the alternative got noticeably worse. If you're on the fence about trying this yourself, here's what I genuinely suggest. Based on everything covered here, dual boot is free, installation from a USB drive takes under an hour, and you lose absolutely nothing by testing it, because your existing Windows installation stays completely untouched the whole time. Give it 2 weeks running your actual daily tasks and see how it feels. And if this gave you something worth thinking about, hit like. It genuinely helps this kind of research-driven video reach more people than the algorithm otherwise would. Subscribe if you want to stay ahead of how this story develops. Because whatever Microsoft's next major Windows release actually turns out to be, and whenever it actually ships, I'll be covering it with the same sourcing standard as this video. Verified, dated, and cited, not recycled rumor. Let me know in the comments. Have you tried a Linux distro since Windows 10 support ended? And if so, what finally pushed you to do it?